It is very exciting to have our speaker today, Arnold Ho. Arnold and I overlapped and spent a lot of time in Banaji Lab together, so I know Arnold quite well, and I'm so happy to have him here. But I'm not the one introducing the fabulous Arnold. It is Stephen, so I will turn it over to Stephen. Just welcome everyone to our colloquium, and I'm sure we're in store for a wonderful talk. Stephen, over to you.
Thanks, Dana, and hi, everyone. Today, we are very lucky to have Professor Arnold Ho speaking with us. He's an associate professor of psychology and organizational studies at the University of Michigan. Broadly speaking, his research focuses on people's preferences and rationalizations for inequality in society, and on how people draw lines between different social groups, in particular, how people categorize each other into different races. His research has published in many top outlets, including JPSB, PNAS, and PSPR. Today, he'll speak about a new theory of racial categorization that explains this process as a function of individual socio-political motives and the specific threats that affect individuals' groups. For asking questions, both clarifying and big questions are okay throughout the talk. And with that, let's please all give a warm IPSR welcome to Professor Arnold Ho.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It's really a great pleasure to be with you all today. I actually grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and so Berkeley was always looming large in my mind, and it's really a great pleasure to be with you today. So today, what I wanted to do was to share with you some work that I've been doing over the last decade or so on how our sociopolitical motivations can influence how we racially categorize other people. And in particular, a lot of this work has focused on how our sociopolitical motives, how monoracial people's sociopolitical motives, that is the motives of those who identify with one race, can influence the way they categorize multiracial people, whether they include them in their in-groups or exclude them to outgroups. And then secondly, I also wanted to introduce a model that I recently developed called the Sociopolitical Motive by Intergroup Threat model to kind of integrate and make sense of all the different perspectives that have been brought to bear to understand how our sociopolitical motives influence racial categorization. In particular, this model identifies the major sociopolitical motives that have been specified by different theories of intergroup relations, and the specific threats that people holding those particular motives respond to that lead them to exhibit biases in the way they categorize others. The second feature of the model that I'll want to underscore later is that it highlights how our motives can lead to different outcomes depending on an actor's group membership and status. And then finally, although the talk will focus on my empirical work on racial categorization, I want to discuss a bit at the end how the model might apply more broadly to understanding intergroup relations, other intergroup phenomena. Okay, so since I will be talking a lot about racial categorization, I just wanted to provide a little bit of background to help understand how I got into this research area. So I really became interested in multiracial categorization because I wanted to understand what implications a growing multiracial population had for the American racial hierarchy and race relations in the US. As some of you may know, between 2000 and 2010, the multiracial population grew by 32% compared to a 9% increase for the monoracial population. And this led a lot of social scientists, including the political scientist Jennifer Hochschild and her colleagues, to theorize that the increasing multiracial population, along with other phenomena, could facilitate the creation of a new racial order, perhaps bring about greater racial equality. And the multiracial population has only continued to increase. So the most recent census, the 2020 census, showed that there's now 34 million roughly multiracial people, which equates to approximately 10% of the American population. Oh, I should have mentioned this earlier. I'm also happy to take questions at any point. So if anyone has any questions, just feel free to shout out or raise your Zoom hand. Okay, so a lot of social scientists, as I was saying, have suggested that maybe this growth in the multiracial population may lead to changing racial dynamics, but that made me think that's only the case if it's true that monoracial people will accept and embrace multiracial people. And we know that throughout American history, that hasn't always been the case. So for most of American history, multiracial people have been categorized according to the rule of hypodescent. So hypo meaning lower and descent, tracing descent to the lower status parent group. And as recently as 1985, Louisiana Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that the great-great-great-granddaughter of a white plantation owner and his slave could not identify herself as white. So this is the story of Susie Phipps, who in the late 1970s applied for a passport and wrote on her application that she's white because that's how she had always identified. And her passport application was rejected because it turns out that on her birth certificate, it said that she was Black according to the rule of hypodescent. And this went all the way through the highest courts in Louisiana. And in 1985, they ruled that if this person Susie Phipps wanted her passport, that she'd have to identify as a Black according to the rule of hypodescent, because a state-appointed genealogist ruled that she had 332nd Black ancestry. While that rule has now been struck down and there's no longer law that dictates that people should be categorized according to this rule of hypodescent, my collaborators and I and others in social psychology have shown that more recently in the 21st century, many people still use the rule of hypodescent informally when they're categorizing others that they encounter in everyday life. So for example, in one of my very early studies, we asked participants very explicitly to imagine a child with 2 Black grandparents and 2 white grandparents, and we asked them, to what extent do you think this person is Black or white? Now you can imagine that if you were asked this question on a survey, there'd be a bit of demand to select equally Black and white in the absence of any other information about this person other than what we've given in this question. And what we find is that despite that demand, roughly 1 in 5 of our participants selected that thought that the person was more Black than white, compared to only about 1 in 20 who thought the person was more white than Black. Can you guys see my cursor by the way when I move it around the screen?
I could see it when you were moving it.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so when we do the statistical analysis, we see that on average, people's ratings of this Black-white, half Black, half white multiracial target deviates from that equally Black and white midpoint significantly. So following that early work and other similar studies that established the basic phenomenon, me and others in social psychology became really interested in, well, why is it that we exhibit these biases in our categorization? And what I'm going to cover today is a lot of the studies that I've done from a motivational perspective, examining how our sociopolitical motives might influence categorization. You know, to be sure, there are other perspectives out there besides the sociopolitical perspective. So for example, there's a fairly well-known cognitive account that argues that based on our learning order the order in which we learn different social groups and their phenotypic characteristics. That can make certain characteristics more salient, which will lead us toward categorization toward a particular group when we encounter a person who blends characteristics from multiple groups. So there are such cognitive accounts out there, but what I'd like to suggest is that those accounts can't as readily help us understand situations where people know exactly what the person's ancestry is or what racial background is, but nevertheless think of the person as belonging to one group more than another. For that, I think we need a motivational perspective. In particular, the motivational accounts that I'll cover are inspired by what are arguably the four most well-known theories of intergroup relations in social psychology today. So social dominance theory, system justification theory, the theory of authoritarianism, and social identity theory. So these theories have been leveraged to help us understand why it is that people may exhibit biases in racial categorization. And I should note that at the outset, that most of the existing work on multiracial categorization looks at dominant group perceivers in particular, and even more specific, a lot of it is looking at white Americans and their categorization of Black, white, or Asian white multiracial people. So that's the first in this section of the studies, the empirical studies I'm going to present are studies involving white American perceivers. But later on, when I introduce the sociopolitical motive by intergroup threat model, I'll also discuss how sociopolitical motives might influence perceivers from other groups. Okay, so for the first major theory that's been brought to bear to help us understand racial categorization biases is social dominance theory. So social dominance theory observes that people differ in their what we call social dominance orientation. So this is the extent to which they prefer society to be organized hierarchically with some groups at the top and other groups at the bottom, and how much they prefer inequality between groups. People's social dominance orientation is thought to be affected by things like their group status, their gender, socialization, their personality or temperament. And it's thought to relate to people's endorsements of ideologies that justify inequality and their propensity to engage in discrimination. It stands to reason, given that people higher in social dominance orientation prefer hierarchical differentiation between groups, that they may also exhibit biases in the way they categorize multiracial people, because multiracial people naturally combine groups that differ in their social status and therefore blur those group boundaries that people higher in SDO prefer. And in fact, what we find is that, particularly in a study we did published in 2013, we find that particularly when the hierarchy is under threat, when our perceivers are introduced to the idea that there's increasing equality between groups, those who are higher in social dominance orientation become more likely to use the rule of hypodescent. And the idea that SDO is related to hypodescent or racial categorization biases more generally has been supported by a lot of other studies, including some that were done by other research groups. The second major theory that's been brought to bear to understand racial categorization, and which I'll include later in my integrative model, is system justification theory. So as many of you may know, system justification theory argues that because of people's epistemic needs for order and certainty in their environment, existential needs to be protected against threats in the environment, and relational needs to maintain positive social relations with others in their social system, they may come to justify the status quo, that is to defend the existing system that they perceive as meeting these three sets of needs. And this can lead to downstream support for policies with relevance for equality. It also stands to reason that the system justification motive could influence racial categorization as well. So you can imagine for someone, for instance, who is really high in their epistemic need for order and certainty in their environment, they prefer, they may exhibit biases in the way they categorize others in order to maintain the racial hierarchy that they know so well. And in fact, there's some evidence for this as well. So Amy Croce and her colleagues in 2013 published a paper where they used political ideology, a liberal conservative scale, as a proxy for system justification, owing to the fact, owing to the theory that those same epistemic, existential, and relational needs are theorized to underlie political conservatism too. And they found that indeed ideology was related to a measure that they call it the point of subjective equality. So the way to interpret this is for those who are at the extreme of conservatism, they're predicted to categorize someone who, a target that they're shown that has 40% Black phenotype and 60% white phenotype according to a photo morphing program that they use. They're equally likely to categorize someone with a 40% Black phenotype as Black or white. Whereas those who are at the extreme and extremely liberal end require the face that they're seeing to be about 50% Black, 50% white, in order to have an equal chance of categorizing that face as Black or white. The third perspective is the theory of authoritarianism. So as strongly suggested by John Duckett's dual process model of prejudice, and something that I'm trying to build on currently, one reason people are the reason people are authoritarian, so authoritarianism, I should first say, is defined by a preference for others to follow social norms, respect authority figures, and intolerance and punishment of those who deviate from those social norms. According to Duckett's model, it's implied that part of the reason why people are authoritarian is because they perceive basic threats in their environment, including threats that might not have anything to do with intergroup relations. And this may lead them to believe that, well, everyone really, this makes them think that, well, we really need to coordinate within our group in order to defend against this threat successfully. And that may lead to a preference for others to follow norms, because having everyone be on the same page and following the same rules and norms may be important for coordinating to defend against those threats. But the consequence of that is that it could also lead to prejudice and discrimination against groups and individuals that one perceives as non-normative. And so it also stands to reason that someone who's authoritarian may be biased in the way they categorize multiracial people, because multiracial people may be seen as non-normative by authoritarians for several reasons. One is because they may combine, they may have membership in groups that are themselves perceived to be non-normative by the authoritarian, and because they have membership in multiple groups it's unclear which particular cultural values they subscribe to most. So that's another reason why authoritarians may be biased. And consistent with this reasoning, my colleague Nor Kateli and others have found in an experiment that when a multiracial target is presented as very conformist, there's really no bias in categorization as a function of RWA, or right-wing authoritarianism levels. Whereas when a target is presented as non-conformist, as deviating from widely accepted social norms, those who are higher in RWA, represented by this thicker dotted line, are less likely to categorize the multiracial target as white. And then lastly, in terms of the major theories of intergroup relations that have been brought to bear to understand racial categorization, we have social identity theory, which argues classically that people may engage in discrimination of various kinds, biases of various kinds, because they derive part of the individual self-esteem from their group esteem. That is how positively evaluated how high status their group is. And because of this, you might also expect individuals who are higher in social identification with a high status group in particular to exhibit biases in the way they categorize multiracial people, because multiracial people may again bring or include membership in a group that is lower status, which could potentially, in someone who's strongly identified with a high status group, in their mind could potentially lead to a decrement in the individual status. I see there are some questions.
I was gonna say there's just one about how this applies to mixed other races. So I think like, not just black, white, but also Asian, black, or white, Asian.
Yeah, this should definitely, we could talk about it in more detail later, but just to give one example of why it should apply broadly, you can imagine that, if rather than categorizing a black-white person, someone who's high in SDO, let's say, is categorizing a person who identifies as Latino and white, that person who's higher in SDO would still want hierarchical differentiation and still perceive someone who identifies as Latino and white as blurring those group boundaries, the status boundaries between Latinx people on the one hand and white people on the other. So this should, we can go into more detail again later on, but it's easy to imagine how these theories can be applied, how these motivations might affect the way people categorize others, regardless of what the combination is. And if someone has a more specific example that they'd like to work through later, I'm more than happy to do that as well. Okay, what was conformity from the previous slide? Assimilation, conformity to one group. So in the Kateli et al. 2014 study, I think conformity was the person is very religious and just generally law-abiding and so on. Whereas the person who was non-conforming was seen to have was portrayed as having more counter-cultural values. That was, I believe, what their manipulation was. Okay, Stephen, if you could also bring up, because I might not be looking at the chat at all times. If you can bring up, if there's other questions, that would be wonderful. Okay, so I've already gone through the rationale for why people higher in social identification, particularly with a high status group, might be biased in the way they racially categorize others. And consistent with this, there's some work actually done at Berkeley back in published in 2005 by Eric Knowles and Kai-Ping Peng, showing that those who are higher in a measure they developed that looked at implicit identification with whites, white identity centrality implicit association test. That was their measure. Those who scored higher on that, meaning they identified more with whites, had a higher threshold required for white categorization. So when a face on this x-axis, when a face was 50% morphed to be 50% white, 50% black, those who are higher on this white identity IAT had only about a 35% probability of categorizing that person as white. Whereas when that same face, one that's 50% white, 50% black, was shown to people who are lower in white identity, they had roughly a 60% likelihood of categorizing that target as white. So evidence that white identity indeed affects our racial categorization of others. Okay, lastly, there's been quite a few studies now done on how racial prejudice might influence our categorization. I should note that prejudice itself might stem from any of the previous motives that I've already discussed. All those previous theories that I've discussed this suggest that each of those various motives can lead to prejudice. So just knowing that prejudice in itself is influencing categorization doesn't let us know which of those motives is influencing categorization. So we know from a lot of research that people generally assign greater weight to entities that they evaluate negatively. So Paul Rosen has done a lot of work on this and has written a really useful review piece in PSPR if you're interested. And so it makes sense that if we negatively evaluate one group, that when we're thinking about a multiracial person, we might more heavily weigh the contribution of that negatively evaluated ancestry in categorizing the multiracial person. And in fact, several years ago, my colleagues and I found that particularly when we prime people with an essentialist view of race, that is, prime them with the idea that race is genetically based rather than socially constructed, people who are higher in anti-Black pro-white bias, in essence, weighed those what they thought were Black genes more heavily in their categorization, leading to greater hyperlicent. Now, really interestingly, consistent with this idea that people more heavily weigh negatively evaluated entities, those who are low in bias, so in this case, anti-white, pro-Black, actually had a tendency to categorize the target as more white. But it's also important to note that we had more people who were anti-Black that were anti-white in the sample of white American research participants. But nevertheless, there was this tendency was seen across several studies suggesting that we do, in fact, more heavily weigh negatively evaluated entities. Okay, so far there are at least several issues that we need to address based on this research that I presented. One is that, and I should say the literature hasn't really adequately addressed this, and this is the motivation for the integrative model that I'm presenting in a moment. So each of, in particular, one major issue is that each of SDO, system justification, RWA, right-wing authoritarianism, and ethnic identification are positively correlated with one another among members of high status groups. And each of them, as I already mentioned, can underpin prejudice. So data from many studies cannot actually arbitrate between these various theoretical accounts that I've presented. And I'm not necessarily pointing the finger at others because I'm just as guilty of not clearly arbitrating between studies myself. So for instance, the study that I presented earlier that we published in 2013, where we showed that white Americans who are higher in SDO are particularly likely to use hyperdescent when presented with the idea that the racial hierarchy was shifting. It could be that white identification, which we didn't measure, and which is positively correlated with SDO among whites, is what's driving the effect rather than SDO in and of itself. So without measuring each of white identification and SDO, we wouldn't know which one is actually responsible for categorization in that case. Additionally, and importantly, the literature has scarcely acknowledged social perceivers from marginalized groups and how their political motivations can influence categorization. So the model that I'm going to present encourages us to think about that as well. So with this in mind, then, I developed this sociopolitical motive by intergroup threat model. Before I dive into this, are there any questions? Okay. Oh, is someone about to say something?
Oh, I was going to say none so far in the chat.
Okay, perfect. All right, so as I mentioned earlier, this model that I developed specifies each of these major sociopolitical motives from the major theories of intergroup relations as potential predictors of racial categorization biases and potentially other intergroup phenomena, and suggests that which of these motives might be most likely to influence whatever outcome you're interested in may depend on particular threats that are salient to the perceiver, and importantly, how those threats map onto or correspond to the specific concerns individuals holding any one of these motives has. And I'll get into that a little bit more in a second. This model suggests that these motives can have both direct and indirect effects through prejudice. So for instance, system justification might have a direct effect on multiracial categorization for the reason I mentioned earlier, because for instance, that people higher in system justification motives prefer order and certainty in their environment. And for that reason, they might be wanting to preserve racial group boundaries as they are. And that would lead to categorization biases. Or each of these motives can also have indirect effects through prejudice. So for example, again, using system justification, people who want to justify or defend the status quo, the existing social system, will tend to be prejudiced against members of marginalized groups because they would prefer to suggest that any inequality is due to deficiencies in members of marginalized groups, as opposed to due to there being a problem with the system. Admitting there's a problem with the system would be the opposite of wanting to defend the system, right? And so that could lead to prejudice, and prejudice in turn, as we've seen earlier, can lead to categorization biases. So there could be both direct and indirect effects. So what this model encourages researchers to do then is to measure the various political motives, sociopolitical motives that they think may be relevant for explaining the phenomenon at hand, to test for incremental predictive validity. it encourages us to consider how one of these particular motives might be more or less relevant depending on the situation, depending on the threats that are salient in the environment. So for instance, a good example of this comes from the Catali et al. 2014 study I mentioned earlier, where in one study, as I mentioned, they manipulated threats to in-group norms by presenting a target as normative or counter-normative. And they measured each of STO, RWA, and racial identification among their white participants. And what they found was that when they manipulated norm threats specifically, that corresponded to the concerns of people who are higher in authoritarianism, who care a lot about norms. And so the norm threat interacted with RWA to predict categorization. But SDO, people who are in SDO, are not especially concerned about norms per se. They're concerned about the hierarchy per se. So SDO didn't interact with this and was not related to categorization in this case. And importantly, they also measured racial identification, which you can imagine could also influence categorization in this case, because again, people who are higher in racial identification care a lot about the standing of their group, and you can imagine that including someone who's non-normative can also influence the status of their group, and so they may be concerned about threats to in-group norms as well. And so a priori, it's certainly possible that that could have been related to categorization, but when they measured all these three variables and manipulated norms, they found that only RWA, but not SDO and not racial ID interacted with the norm threat. So by measuring each of these, they were able to understand if they added to our understanding, were able to whether each of these motives were able to predict categorization biases. And they were able to better understand under what circumstances, what situations each of these might be most active in predicting categorization. So the second point that I wanted to bring up is that this model helps to think through what members of different groups that vary in their status, how sociopolitical motives might influence these different groups. So for instance, so in the model, in our 2020 PSPR paper, for each of these paths, we specified the predicted relation between a motive and the outcome for groups that vary in their status. So for instance, with respect to racial identification, for white perceivers, as I've already mentioned, higher identification may lead to outgroup categorization of a multiracial person. But this has only been shown recently and only in one study that me and my collaborators worked on several years ago. The relation is actually the opposite for Black perceivers, and you might expect this based on the idea that for a member of a group that has lower status in society, that's marginalized, there may be some advantage to including multiracial people in the in-group rather than excluding them, particularly if you feel that they could be counted on to collaborate with the in-group to try to achieve greater equality. And so that stands to reason that among marginalized group members, racial identification might actually lead to in-group categorization rather than out-group categorization. And we found some evidence that was consistent with that a couple of years ago. We also specify in this model how third-party perceivers, that is those that don't have, that don't share group membership with a multiracial person, might act as a function of their political motives. In the case of racial identification, it's not expected that third-party perceivers would show biases as a function of racial identification, because how they categorize a multiracial person doesn't have direct implications for the standing of their in-group. But for some of these other sociopolitical motives, such as social dominance orientation, we would expect each of high status perceivers, low status perceivers, and third-party perceivers to be driven by the motive. I should note that even when the direction of the relation between a motive and the outcome is the same, group status or membership can still matter. So for instance, I reanalyzed some data we collected a couple of years ago on white and Black American perceivers, examining how their levels of social dominance orientation was related to outgroup categorization. And what we find is that for both Black and white perceivers, SDO is positively related to outgroup categorization, but interestingly, there's a main effect of perceiver group membership such that only white perceivers on average engage in outgroup categorization, and that's driven by those who are higher in their social dominance orientation who prefer hierarchical differentiation. And members of marginalized groups, in this particular case, Black perceivers on average only engage in in-group categorization, and this is driven by lower levels of social dominance orientation or egalitarianism rather than anti-egalitarianism. And we showed in this 2017 paper that was due to egalitarian tendency to perceive that both Black and Black-white individuals are subject to discrimination, and therefore they share a common fate. And that was related to including them in the in-group. So even when the predicted direction of the relation between a motive and outcome is the same, group standing and membership can still have an effect. And then in this case, as I mentioned, third-party perceivers are also expected to be influenced by their SDO, because we've shown in other work, in a 2012 paper, for instance, that SDO is related to, SDO represents an abstract preference for hierarchy, so not just a preference for a particular hierarchy, but a preference for hierarchy in general. So when we present participants with a novel hierarchy, or a novel organization rather, and ask them how they want various groups to be arranged in that organization, people who are higher SDO prefer that groups are hierarchically arranged in this novel organization. And so you might expect, for instance, an Asian monoracial perceiver who's categorizing a Black-white person, that is, who doesn't share membership with the groups represented by the multiracial person, a third-party perceiver in this case, to nevertheless categorize the target as more Black than white to the extent that they're higher in social dominance orientation, because that still satisfies their preference for hierarchy and hierarchical differentiation. So in sum then, the sociopolitical motive by intergroup threat model is a comprehensive person by situation motivational account of racial categorization. It integrates motivational theories of intergroup relations. It complements cognitive accounts. And I'd like to suggest that it applies broadly to intergroup relations. And perhaps the key point is that it should apply to any phenomenon that is of relevance to perceivers holding the various motives that are specified. So for instance, in what might be considered a prototype of the sociopolitical motive by intergroup threat model, Lotta Thompson and colleagues found that when an immigrant was presented as someone who wanted to assimilate, people who are higher in SDO were actually more likely to want to persecute immigrants than people lower in SDO, because assimilation is, in their mind, breaching those group boundaries that person higher in SDO desires. Whereas when the person did not want to assimilate, that could be taken as a sign that the person doesn't share the values of the host culture or the dominant group. And in that case, they found those people who are higher in RWA rather than SDO, who wanted to engage more in immigrant persecution. So again, suggesting how each of these motives can be responsible, more or less responsible for intergroup motives, depending on the threats that are presented and how those threats map onto the concerns of those holding these particular motives. We also work through an examples suggesting that these motives could be differentially responsible for Brexit support in our 2020 theory piece. You can imagine how it can be related to any number of phenomena. And I'd be happy to, in the Q&A that's coming up, talk through an example if any of you are interested in doing so. And so with that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and also thank my collaborators on this research, Noor Kiltaley of Northwestern, Jackie Chen of UConn, Masrin Banaji, who is one of my mentors at Harvard, and Susan Gelman, my colleague at Michigan, and also my former and current graduate students, Stephen Roberts, now at Stanford, Rachel Fine, now postdoc at UC San Diego, Nadia Vasugi, who's going to be an assistant professor at Grinnell College starting next year, and Wilson Merrill, current graduate student, who's also doing some related work with me. And then most of all, I wanted to thank Jim Sedanius, who was my primary advisor at Harvard, a collaborator on some of the early work. He passed away last year, as many of you probably know, but he continues to inspire a lot of my thinking. So I want to thank him most of all. All right, thank you all. And I'm now happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, hi.
Hi, so great talk. Thank you so much for joining us. I had a couple questions, if I may. The first one, and this may be extrapolation, but especially since you mentioned the third party rating potential, I'm wondering if there is any work on how multiracial people categorize themselves and then perceive others, especially same race multiracial people, how those categorizations might be. And then the other one is more related to your introduction. So you mentioned what this could possibly mean for a new social order. And I was thinking about how there are other countries that have similar racial stratifications, but didn't use hypodescent. So throughout Latin America, for example, where really more hyper descent. And so I'm wondering what you think the implications of this really are long term. Is it just that we'll move away from categorization and just rely more on colorism, or do you see something else? So thank you.
It's interesting. I'm glad you brought up. I'll answer the second question first. I'm glad you brought up categorization in other contexts, particularly in Latin America. I've thought a little bit about this, and in fact, Nadia Fasugi, one of my graduate students, and I are starting to work on this a bit, thinking through how the same sociopolitical motives, like our social dominance motives, might lead to different categorization outcomes in different contexts, depending on how those outcomes support the motive. So let me put that more concretely. I think the best example, I'll mention Latin America in a second, but the best example of this, I think, comes from South Africa. In the 1900s, there was actually a period of time where the government, the dominant group members in government granted multiracial people an in-between status, but their goals were actually anti-egalitarian rather than egalitarian. Their goals, their particular goal was to actually, I think he's a historian Anthony Marks actually talks about this. Their goal was to try to break apart collective action between multiracial people and Black monoracial people. So even though it seems like they're being a little bit more egalitarian by kind of granting more privileges to this in-between group, or at least more inclusive, let's say, that inclusivity can actually be conditional on this perception that it can actually help uphold the hierarchy by preventing collective action. So it's interesting how when you think of different contexts, even if the outcome seems more inclusive or fairer, it may actually be driven by the same sociopolitical motivation. And Latin America is a really interesting context. There, as you said, there is a tendency almost even to hyper-descent. But that was also actually driven by an extremely racist theory that was promulgated in the also throughout the 1900s, where they actually believed that you could in a sense purify the Black race by having multiracialism, by having Black ancestry mixed with white ancestry. So I mean, that's obviously extremely racist and incorrect, but that was their motivation for embracing, in a sense, multiracialism. So again, a seemingly more positive outcome is actually driven by a very negative sociopolitical motivation. And that's something we're looking into more now. In terms of your first question, we're also looking into that a little bit more now. So we have some preliminary evidence that people's multiracial people's own sociopolitical motivations can influence how they self-categorize. So for instance, Black, white, multiracial people who are lower in SDO, we're seeing in some data, tend to be more likely to categorize themselves as members of their marginalized group. So as Black in particular in that case. And you can imagine that might influence how they categorize other multiracial people too, to complete the other part of your question.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you. So, I mean, I won't hold my breath that anti-Blackness is going anywhere, but yeah. I really appreciate your talk, and go blue. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Great talk. Really interesting stuff. Two questions. First, you mentioned some work with Brexit, and I've been wondering throughout how this applies to political divisions. And I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Oh, sure. So well, specifically, I don't know that a ton of research. There has some research that I've found. I haven't studied Brexit personally, but there is some research that I've found that have brought to bear these various intergroup perspectives on understanding it. In the review or theory paper that we wrote, we worked through an example to try to demonstrate that this model might apply to other phenomena, including phenomena outside the US, since a lot of our studies were based in the US. We used the example of Brexit, and we theorized that, you know, with Brexit, there were people who supported Brexit had a number of arguments for why they supported it, but a lot of them were organized around economic sovereignty, so the right for the UK to determine their own economic future and to set economic policies that they felt were most beneficial for their ingroup, for their country. And then a second major factor in it was, in the Brexit decision, was anti-immigrant, anti-refugee sentiment, right? And so we reasoned that this model should very much apply because people who are higher in authoritarianism, for instance, are particularly concerned about eroding in-group norms. And so you can imagine if politicians were playing on that fair and talking about how immigrants and refugees are eroding traditional British values, that it'd be people who are higher in authoritarianism in that case who are driving Brexit support. Whereas if you imagine someone who is very economically conservative raising the flag about the need to maintain economic sovereignty In that case, you might expect someone who is very high in their British national identification to be most likely to want to support Brexit because they're most concerned about maintaining the standing of the UK in the world.
Great.
Oh, go ahead.
No, so that's really interesting. And I think integrating these models is so helpful for applying to all these areas of intergroup stuff. The one more general question I had is, are you aware of any research that has looked at these issues in non-humans? Non-human primates, for example.
That's fascinating. Yeah, there is certainly one article that is actually so I think it would help to think about this in terms of the various sociopolitical motives I talked about. Preference for hierarchy, tolerance of aggression versus wanting greater equality, for instance, or social dominance orientation. There's one article that recently came to my attention. It's written by Brian Hare and his colleagues on the self-domestication hypothesis. And what he found was that among bonobos who lived in much more resource-rich environments, compared to another species, it's escaping me at the moment, another species who lived primarily in a resource-scarce environment, bonobos were actually much more egalitarian and intolerant of dominance and dominance-seeking, hierarchical-seeking behavior. So that's not so much examining discrimination per se among primates or a non-human species, but it does suggest that there could be similar ecological underpinnings of our political motivations in different species, something that I'm actually interested in exploring a bit more down the line.
Great, thank you.
A lot, just pick one, and if not,
right.
So the first one is really just, I wanted to ask you to, the facial morphing procedure seems to really be kind of a racial feature manipulation, and I got a little confused as to how interchangeable race and culture or race and ethnicity are in terms of what's driving these effects. And so that was I just wanted to get your sense of whether they're interchangeable basically, or whether there really are a separate set of relationships. And the other one, the other question is just comes from your early comment, which I thought was just the data on how the explosive growth in the prevalence of biracial people in the population, and wondering if this provides some opportunities for looking at familiarity effects as this becomes more and more an everyday occurrence. More and more people are going to be exposed to this, and it's not going to seem as exotic as maybe it once did.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So okay. Oh, your first question, I'm reminding myself, was
a race versus culture.
Right. So I'm very much adopt the standpoint that all these are interchangeable. So I'm a social dominance theorist. That's how I identify primarily. And what we argue is that people differentiate along three lines primarily: age, sex, and group membership. And I mean, these are the three divisions that have been prevalent across all of human history. There haven't always been, not every society has always had racial groups per se, but they've often or always had tribal memberships, right, of all various sorts, and that could be defined along a number of lines. And there's compelling evidence that I won't have time to get into too much, but if you're interested in the idea, Rob Kurzban, John Tooby, and Lita Kosmides have done some really interesting work showing that people can interchange these various divisions. And to your second question, can you remind me really quickly?
Just the effect of the changing demographics of biraciality.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, I think, you know, sadly, we do have a propensity to divide people by groups, and think of groups as having essences that kind of define what they are. And so a good example of this comes, I think, a real world example comes from how we think about Latinx people. So Latinx people are, you know, historically a multiracial group, right? Consisting of Europeans, Native Americans, and Africans. But now in many contexts in the US, for example, we think of them as just a monolithic, a uniform group that has its own identity and essence. We think of them as a monoracial group rather than as a multiracial group. So I think to respond to your question, I do think that, you know, the way we think about the group might change. So maybe we won't use hypodescent as I defined it. But I also don't know that we would kind of include that group with one of any other of the existing monoracial groups either. We might ascribe a new identity to it, but then the same cognitive mechanisms will then again apply to how we think about that.
So this is not going to disappear anytime soon.
Yeah, right, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Cool. And then I'll read Iris's question.
Okay.
She said, love the talk. I'm curious about demand and especially its effects on your outcome measure. You examined systematically how to get around demand and whether that yields larger or more reliable effects.
Yeah, I mean, not so we haven't examined that systematically, but I think it's useful to note that some of the studies I presented, not all my own, have relied on different types of outcome measures. So for example, Amy Croce has used a speeded categorization test to get at that point of subjective equality that I mentioned, the point at which, you know, someone's equally likely to categorize the target as black or white. And that's arguably more of a measure of unconscious beliefs because people are doing it really rapidly. They're not thinking about it deliberately. They're just kind of categorizing faces as quickly as possible into one group or another. And she finds that that's related to conservatism, right? And we've shown similar effects using more explicit measures that capture more deliberate responding. And so I think I don't know that any of the research that's looked at the sociopolitical motive categorization relation as a function of how implicit versus explicit and how much demand the task requires, but we've shown relations across different types of tasks. So I think that helps. And a lot of these effects, like the SDO effects, have been shown across a number of studies and done by different research groups as well. So that helps assure us of the replicability or reliability of the findings as well.
Is that it? No more questions? People are saying thank you. Iris is saying thank you. Arnold, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Yay, thank you so much.